so much for agreeing to this interview. I've actually been wondering about you for so many years because I knew even just seeing you on the cover of my grandma's Buck Owens records, I was like, he's a Chicano. I had to go between families. Like my mother was white, my other side of my family is Tejano. Always felt kind of growing up that I had to code switch between cultures. It was so interesting to me seeing you in the context of country, because even though there are examples in country music of non-white people playing in the genre, it is still rare and unique, even to this day, and we know that. When I've heard people interview you before, they do always want to focus on your time in Buck Owens in particular, but I've never really heard them talk about or ask you about what life was like for you growing up in Corpus, kind of leading into that period of time.
Why me? And how could you tell that I was Chicano or Tejano?
Well, that's what's so funny is because
I was from, you knew I was from Corpus? Or?
No, because when I was a kid, all of the music culture that I grew up with on the white side of my family, my grandma Nellie's record collection, my exposure to these musicians was purely passive. Like, I wasn't seeking out these records. This was media that she had playing in her house, and I just was passively absorbing. Even though I didn't have the language to articulate the differences between my family, and I wasn't consciously making a distinction of me being a relatively biracial kid, any time that I would switch between houses, I couldn't help but note the differences in the culture. You know, flipping through the records and then seeing you, like someone who kind of looked like me and my dad's side of the family, in a sea of white people in the records that she has, like minus Charlie Pride. Just there was a familiarity.
It's interesting because a lot of people would not think that I was Hispanic at all, especially at that time. You know, a lot of people that I met, they would think maybe I was more American Indian than Indian, and I don't see it myself. But now, when I was in Japan, I saw young men that had my profile, you know, like in elevators.
Yeah.
You know, I noticed, I said, well, you know, this is the closest thing to me that I've seen so far, you know, but never Hispanic.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when we did the Buckaroo album covers, you know, I wanted to be bandido.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so that's why the outfit and the fake mustache.
Yeah.
Because at that time I was like 20, 21, and really couldn't grow one.
Yeah.
At that point, you know.
I tracked you down via the AFM Local 257. For me, the Buckaroos lineup from 64 to 67 is the definitive classic lineup, as it is for so many fans of the music. Holly was recorded an interview with Country Standard Time. He said it was chemistry when they were asking, like, what was it about that magic? Why does everybody feel like it's the inarguable lineup for Buck Owens and the Buckaroos? He also expressed that all of you were just in the right place in the right time. But for you, why do you think people feel that that particular lineup was the definitive lineup?
Possibly because that's when Buck started being successful. You know, before he had a hit song, nobody noticed him, you know. There had been other editions before the one that I was in, and the band, actually the person that gave the band the name, Merle Haggard, he had been with Buck. I think he played bass, and he did a very short stint with Buck, you know, probably a couple of years before I was there. There had been two other drummers before me that I know were part of what was Buck's band. It wasn't until he became really popular and that we were the guys behind him at that time.
Yeah.
It could have been anyone, you know.
Yeah.
But it just happened at that time, you know.
Did you know that your family has crypto-Jewish origins that come from Portugal and Spain? Did you know this?
No, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, I just wondered.
Because I remember asking my grandfather, on my dad's father, who lived Rio Bravo. This Narciso.
Narciso.
That's my grandfather's name. Papa Chicho, we call him. But I remember as a youngster taking trips to go see him, usually just my dad and I. And I remember asking him, about our family, the ancestors. And I'm pretty sure he said that it was it was non-Spanish. Now, he looked very Anglo, my grandfather. My grandmother, who wasn't alive at that time, but I remember her from years earlier, she was very white and speckled, freckles.
And what was her name?
Manuela. My dad was named after her. She was pretty well, had bad health. The only time I ever saw her was she was in bed all the time. And my grandfather used to say, "Okay, hijito, sóbale el brazo," and her hands. And that's when I noticed that she was very white, and it looked like her skin looked like oatmeal. So when I asked my grandfather about the family, I'm pretty sure he said Belgium.
Interesting. And this was Narciso?
Yeah, Narciso. Okay. And the reason that I kind of stuck with that, because that through Mexican history, it was more than just the Spaniards that occupied Mexico, the French,
the
and Germans. Okay, and so what's between France and Germany? Belgium.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of mercenaries that were adventurers and just wanted to go on an adventure to another part of the world. It wasn't French, it wasn't Spanish. Could have been Portuguese for all I know, but anyway, that's where, in my mind, that's what's been in there all these years.
Like, talking about the Cantu family, was there a tradition or a history of music that came from any of it? Really?
None. My dad played harmonica, but he just picked it up on his own.
Well, do you think he was good?
Well, from what I recall, and this is before I had anything to do with music, it was pleasing to hear him. We took a long trip. This was maybe I was already in my 30s, and this after Buck Owens, and when I was living out in the Bay Area, San Francisco. My mother had been living in Los Angeles area.
Oh, she was?
Yeah, probably early 70s, mainly to help my sister with her son. I went to Corpus to drive with my dad to Los Angeles, and we drove in his old Ford Falcon. And I had heard my dad play harmonica before, but on that long trip, I recorded him. The small little decks, portables. So he told me a few stories. I've got those tapes somewhere.
Yeah. And
he sounded like in tune, and nothing was out.
Yeah.
His intonation, singing the Tejano style songs. But I knew that he loved music. He loved to dance, because we used to go to dances at La Terraza there in Corpus. Yeah. Off I think it was on Leopard Street. My mom didn't dance. She just watched him dance.
Really?
He'd go out there and find himself 2 or 3 partners, and off he went. He used to try to get her to dance with him at home while there was some music going on. And she was just didn't want to have anything to do with it. So we'd go to hear the Tejano bands, and I was always into the music.
Did you have a lot of albums in the house?
No albums until I started collecting them.
Did you ever ask why? Was it just...
There was no reason for me to ask why. There was no... The radio was the family album, because I don't think... My dad worked every day, so he didn't listen to the radio. My mom, I don't recall turning the radio on. Well, she worked it during the day too, and I was in school. So there was no music. The only time I heard music on a regular basis was my Aunt Anita, my mother's older sister. And she always had conjunto, you know, going on.
Yeah.
Either accordion or alto saxophone, you know, playing the melodies. And so I heard that, you know, on a regular basis. That's the music that I grew up listening to. We'd go to the movies, usually my dad and I. There'd be an intermission band, and it was conjunto. And so I wanted to play accordion.
In later conjunto culture, they did start to bring in drum sets, but I know like in earlier, the drums weren't always present.
No, they were at that time.
They were at that time.
So, like during the terraza years, you know, that we go, I was always attracted to the drummers, you know, to the drum. I like the music, I like the accordion very much, but because that was the main voice, you know. But I always enjoyed the drums, and especially parades, the Buccaneer Day parades, you know, being on the side of the street and having the marching band go by. Those drums just drove me nuts, you know, the parade drums. So eventually, so it made sense that when I got into junior high school, that I wanted to join the marching band.
Yeah.
And that's how I got started.
What is, like, if you can think back to the earliest memory that you have of, like, awakening to the concept of music? Like, can you remember that?
Conjunto.
How old you were?
Well, probably, I was in elementary school. I always had this feeling, no matter where I heard a band, that I could go up and play. And I knew I couldn't.
Yeah.
But, I mean, play the drums.
Yeah. Did you have that kind of confidence or that kind of feeling in any other part of your life, or was it just that where you were like, I can do this?
It was isolated to music.
Interesting. So do you feel
And I wasn't a kid that went around, you know, as they say, banging on the tabletops and at school, you know, like nothing like that. I was always very quiet.
Yeah.
Quiet and shy.
Now, I mean, Buck had mentioned in his autobiography that he felt like there was some sort of, like, he and Don had some sort of other lifetime playing together in music. So when you're talking just now with that, like, do you feel that that was almost some sort of cosmic or spiritual saying, like, this is your calling?
Look, I wasn't aware of any such things back then. I was just a young kid, you know, running barefoot in the neighborhood, getting into mischief. You know, doing whatever the rest of the other kids did because that's all we had, you know.
What was your community like in Corpus?
It was barrio.
Yeah.
Not as bad as you might think. It was pretty. I was part of a neighborhood gang.
Yeah.
You know, like
when
everyone.
you say gang, define
well,
the gang.
we never, just kids that got together and did mischief in the neighborhood. Like I remember. And this is what went on at night, okay? We'd all get together and decide what neighborhood we wanted to go to. And say, like, for example, I'm seeing this right in my mind, like maybe 2 blocks away, there was a house that had these peach trees around it. So we'd go and sneak, and it was dark anyway, you know, and we'd pick peaches, you know. And run like hell, you know, after we were done, you know. We didn't go around fighting other neighborhoods or looking for trouble, you know. Nothing like that. Just.
Was your family, were they strict or disciplinarians?
Yeah, very.
They were?
Yeah.
And there were only the 2 of you, and, you know, on my mom's side of the family, she came from a bigger family. She was the baby. She talks about how the baby can get away with murder, but then if there's only just the 2 of you.
Well, my sister was my dad's, you know, little princess, so to speak. And she took after him a lot more. I was more like my mom in the sense.
And when you say that, like.
My mom, it took a lot to get her riled up. My sister is quick-tempered like my dad. You know, it took a lot to get me to be like that. I was more laid back, like my mom, you know. They were very strict with me, but I still went ahead and did what I wanted.
Yeah. Well, what were the repercussions?
Well, okay, I'd come in late at night, and I'd sneak into my bed, and as soon as I got comfortable, I'd hear my dad's voice saying,
"Oh no."
Okay, in Spanish, you know. He'd always use the word cuenta, you know.
Like what's your payment or what's the cost?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, you're supposed to be home
Yeah.
before the lights are out, and here you come,
Yeah.
sneaking in, and they would always leave the door unlocked, the screen door,
It's almost like they were tempting you.
Well, they knew that I would do
Yeah.
what I did, but they weren't going to let me get away with it.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
much.
how young are we talking? when
Well,
you
we're
start
talking
this
about
young?
like I was in the 4th, 5th grade.
Yeah. But I mean, the community then, like with hindsight, the community was pretty safe for you.
Yeah, it
right?
was.
Yeah.
It was. There was no actual violence going on in our neighborhoods.
Yeah. I mean, like, what
You know.
kind of trouble could you really get into?
Nothing heavy.
Yeah.
Nothing to hurt anyone.
Yeah.
Nothing like that. Otherwise, I'd be a different person right now.
How did you transition? You talked about you wanted to play accordion, but you also gravitated to the drums. So we know that you joined the junior high band. How did the transition?
And also, I must add, because it reminds me of that period when I was in the 4th grade, that I heard the song "Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White," which featured a trumpet. And once I heard that totally drove me nuts. That's what I thought I wanted to learn to play someday.
I guess we'll skip to junior high since that's when you started in band.
Halfway through my 7th grade year, I realized that I wasn't in band, and because that had been my elective, what happened was in the 6th grade, when I had this form to fill out in terms of what I was interested in and what have you, and I put art, because I was into drawing as well, and not too bad. I was pretty good. You could tell what it was. And so art and music were the two things that I was interested in. But I put art first. So that they put me in the art class instead of the band class. And so I went and talked to the counselor and found out what mistake I had made. And so come January, they put me in the band class. So that's how I started in music, finally,
So how did you choose what instrument you
Okay,
played?
by then, I was still undecided for if I wanted. I knew I couldn't learn accordion in the marching band, so I was trumpet or drums. But I was more drawn to the drums. And when I walked into the band room, I remember distinctly. I glanced to the right where the band was, and I saw right to my right was where the drummers were. And as soon as I saw the marching drums, I decided right there. It wasn't long that I'd been in the beginner band that I found out that the A band, which is the marching band, the one that did the concerts and football games, rehearsed before classes started. I ended up getting to school early, and I could hear the band playing when I got to school. It wasn't long, the band director, Mr. Joe Medina, called me over, and he said, go up and be with the drummers. So he knew that I had a heavy interest. So he sent me up there. There weren't enough drummers to cover all the instruments that needed to be, and there was no bass drum. So after one or two songs, he said, okay, Willie, okay, guys, give Willie the bass drum mallet and put him behind the bass drum.
Nice.
And
Promotion.
I didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And so somebody in the drum section said, well, what you do is you keep time for us. And this is what you do. And I'm just scared to death, because I'd never been next to a drum before, other than beginner class. I played a few tunes with them playing bass drum, and that was kind of like my initiation. And I'm kind of reliving it right now because I'm getting all high, so to speak. Over the thought of what happened then and what it felt like, the experience of playing music with other people.
Would you say that, looking back, that you had that timing like right away?
I think I just naturally had some semblance of what time was, because they just let me play and play. You know, I was on bass drum for the rest of the rehearsal.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been 1, 2 tunes. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't remember that, because I was so elated by the experience that it's impossible for me to remember. My subconscious won't go there, other than just the initial impact of what happened. You know, I was in it 5 months, and pretty well, just my band director. I remember distinctly. He came up and said, "Okay, Willie, this is how you hold the sticks," and the marching drums were all no stands. They were on chairs, you know, like kitchen chairs, you know, and you just set them sideways, so that there was at a slant. And so I learned traditional grip instead of match grip. Left hand is this way. It's a good thing I was right-handed, because that's how the drum is.
Yeah.
And so he said, you let the sticks bounce. And so that was like my beginning of drum lesson. And all I did was just watch the other kids play, and I just did the best I could. That's the only time that I recall him showing me what to do. You kind of teach yourself as you go along by watching the ones that are better than you. That's how I got through. There were auditions for the marching band at the end of the school year, and there was either the A band or the B band, which is the intermediate band. I went to the audition and it made sense that I had been playing long enough. But Miss Medina said, Willie, I put you in the B band because there's certain rudiments that you are just not playing how they should sound. And he says, what I'll do is I'll give you till a couple of months in the summer to practice up. And he made a list of the rudiments that I needed to improve. And he said, you can come in, we're having summer band, and I will give you a test then and see if you qualify. In the meantime, my mom bought me a snare drum, a $20 marching parade drum, a Boy Scout drum. That's what they were called back then. From Alamo Loan Company, downtown Corpus. And she paid, it was $20 that she spent on that, you know, for that drum. And so she wanted me to have something to practice on, so that hopefully it would help me improve.
So they were very supportive of you being a musician.
My mom wanted me to have this, you know, because she knew that it was something that that I was totally into. And my dad, you know, he'd come in from work totally dead tired, and so he just did not want to hear me practicing. You know, after a certain time, and so I did. You know, it was my mom that really all the encouragement came mainly from.
So there was never
at that point, you know.
So there wasn't like an emphasis for you, like your parents never pressured you to go take your career or go in a certain direction.
They were happy that I was home trying to learn to play the drum than being out in the neighborhood getting to mischief.
That makes sense.
And by that time we lived in a place called La Armada, and what it was, originally they were, I think, military homes. You know, it changed to where anyone in the city could live there. You know, and it was still pretty low income rent. You know, and it was joining the band, the beginner band, and then the regular marching band. It kept me away from the influence of other kids. There was this drummer that was a year older than me, became a really good friend, close friend of mine, John Amshoff. And it so happened that he lived 2 blocks away from where I lived. We auditioned for chair position, and you know, he came first, which I figured he probably should be, because I knew he played better than me. But I cannot believe how I became second chair out of, you know, like four snare drummers. So that's how it was that whole school year. It was between him and me, because I would improve in this, and then he would get better. I'd improve on something else, and it was like back and forth all week. And so we became, once we found out we lived that close to each other, we got really close, and we used to practice together. And
now you mentioned snare just now, so you're on
snare drum. That's basically
okay, just making
what
sure you're...
you know. If you were going to be in the marching band, you wanted to be a snare drummer. That's what I wanted to play. But if you were, say, like fourth chair snare drummer, and there was only 3 snare drums, you end up on bass drum or cymbals. You still had to be competent in order to be in the band, to play those other instruments. That was kind of like the beginning of me wanting to be a drummer. And also at that time, my mom, my parents bought me a little record player. So I started little by little collecting LPs.
Were you having to work a small job on the side to pay for the LPs, or they were buying
Well,
them?
you see, I had already been working as a shoeshine boy, made my own little shoeshine box, and would walk barefoot during the summers, down to downtown Corpus or anywhere that my feet would get me to. And we're talking about walk quite a long distance. And it didn't matter. I knew I could go, I had my feet, so I could go, I didn't have to ride the bus, I could walk. So that's what you do.
Yeah.
And during those times, during those years, people just walked everywhere. If they didn't have a car, they just walked. Or if they couldn't afford the bus, you walked.
So what albums were you buying then?
So my very first album was probably marches, because that's the music that I was learning to play in school. My mother would bring records because my mom cleaned homes, the people that she knew would give her, once they found out that I was into music, they'd give her these 78s of march music or of different things, Ferrante and Teicher, pianists. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They were real popular back then. It didn't matter what the music was, I listened to it. I hadn't decided that jazz was what I wanted to pursue. At that point, I was just into music, period. And anything on TV like Lawrence Welk or Sammy Cave, which is also another of that style band, any time I knew they were going to be on, I wanted to see what the drummer did, and just listen to the music. So,
were you also listening to shortwave radio that would bring border stations?
Well, not quite. I never owned a shortwave radio, but I had my own little radio, and once everyone else would go to sleep and I couldn't go to sleep, I'd always get on the radio and listen to whatever I could find on there. My junior high school band director, Joe Medina, he had been in the service and done some traveling to California and seen the bigger picture. He was into psychology, and I didn't realize that's what it was then. But behind him, in the band room, he was at the center of the band, and it was each section was tiered. The percussion section was up on maybe the 5th tier, and so we're at the back, and so everybody can see the band director by sitting like that, But behind him, you can also see the big sign that was behind him that said, "Think," So you saw that. If you're looking at him, you saw that, and I'll never forget that. It stayed with me throughout my whole life. That's the biggest thing. That if you ask me one thing that I remember is, and he made that sign himself and put it up there in bright letters, bright colors. He was constantly encouraging us to practice, to improve, and not to set any limit in what we could do. And he said, he's the one that said, if you play Carnegie Hall, you've made it. Well, I didn't know that was going to happen. I was maybe like 20 years old, when that happened. And so I thought of that, and I'm thinking, so what now? There's got to be more to life than just this.
You explored so many different musical cultures and genres. But when I think about, in particular, Texas, where you were growing up in Corpus Christi, there is a mixture in that area of the Spanish traditions, whether it's instruments that were used in conjunto or that developed later on into what's now Mexico and Texas. You have indigenous traditions, whether it's West Africa's drum ensemble tradition, through like the Bantu languages, the tonal languages, and being able to reproduce the languages using the drums. Indigenous people to what is now the U.S. and Mexico, also their drumming and dance traditions. You've got the accordion coming in from German and Czech immigrants. So you have in that area the coalescing of all of these different cultures, and you're absorbing this as a kid growing up.
A lot of it, like the African culture stuff, I was totally unaware of, other than what I saw in the movies. The black culture in Corpus was through my jazz experience. The fact that I had become, a young jazz musician, and I became professional very young, afforded me to go places where a lot of people wouldn't go, and play some of the black clubs because I could play.
Was Corpus pretty segregated?
Yes, it was.
So even for you to play in jazz bands or in the country band that you were in when you ended up meeting Dawn and the group, so were these segregated bands that you were playing?
Well, okay, so before I met Dawn, okay, I'd been at this club maybe like a couple of months, okay?
And this is the Maverick Club?
The Maverick Club, which was a new club in North Beach. Before that happened, I did not like country music. The twangy, like Hank Williams, that style, the older style. I didn't listen to it. I'd heard what were designated as country songs, like Marty Robbins, maybe a couple of other people, Sonny James, on the radio growing up, like early, Fraulein, Bobby Helms. My mother liked country music. She loved Tex Ritter. And when Tex Ritter had his show, Country Style USA was the name of it, the Collins kids were the only ones that interested me.
What about them interested you?
Well, there was Lori and Larry, and I was totally smitten by Lori.
Yeah.
And just the fact that this girl sang so good, and she wore this Annie Oakley outfit, and Larry was this wild young kid on guitar. It was an unusual thing, I watched the program mainly because my mom watched it. I didn't know if I liked it or not. I was just there because I was there. The same thing with Lawrence Welk, the drummer. That's what I wanted to see. Then when they had their own little Dixieland band, I kept waiting for them to do that every show. They didn't. That was the most exciting thing that happened on there.
How early did you have access to television?
This is it all happened between 6th and 7th grade. We did not have a television before then. That was a big change, having something to watch on TV that had music. Plus the soundtracks to I Love Lucy, which were all done in LA. It was all good music, even though it was studio bands. The players in the studios had to be great really good, be able to read anything and accomplished musicians. They put in their time practicing just like I was doing,
What was your first live music experience? Was it combined with your first session gig?
We need to backtrack a little bit, because when I was in the junior high school band, several things happened. On the way home, in between La Armada and Winfield Junior High School, I walked that every day. Well, there was a junior college halfway between, and it was Del Mar Junior College, and they had this great marching band. And usually when I was headed home after school, I could hear the band rehearsing. So I'd run to wherever they were. I'd sit in the grass there and watch the drummers. Bob Johnson and Doyle Horton. And there was a woman, a young lady that played third snare drum sometimes. She had been the bass drummer at Windseal. Sharon McAfee was her name. But she was also a very good snare drummer. The reason I know is because one time on the way home, I saw her out wearing a snare drum, out just in the field by herself, playing, you know. And I was just amazed at how well she played. She was in the Delmar band, a marching band and concert band. I befriended the two male drummers because they were more available than she was. Later on, I started going into the practice rooms in the band hall of the junior college to hear the band rehearse. And so I used to study him, you know, the way he played, the way he held the sticks. And so that's how I basically learned, from watching people that I thought that were better than me, you know, play. And as well as my friend John Amsoff. During that 8th grade year, my band director said, listen, I'm putting a band together for the school dance. You know, why don't you come out? I'll introduce you to the drummer. And that was Beto Garcia Jr., who became my drum teacher later on. I was there at the dance, and all I could do is watch him all night long. And I tried to go up and talk to him, and I was just so nervous, introduced myself, and somebody else came along, he started talking, and so I just left. Months later, he came to our home trying to recruit kids for Sunday school. I hadn't been going to church at that time, but I started because of him. You know, I was upstairs practicing along to a Gene Krupa record, and I didn't have a drum set. I was just a makeshift drums from school. In he walks with my dad, and so that's how I met him. He invited me to study with him, and I wasn't sure that we could afford it, but he said he would charge me $3, and my dad said that he would do what he could to pay for that. $3 was a lot of money back then. And so this is like maybe 1958, 1959. Before I had a lesson, he said, I'm doing a jazz concert over at Del Mar College. Why don't you come? He knew I was interested in jazz by that time. Beto, okay? Because I was playing along to Gene Krupa, which is a great jazz drummer.
Had you settled in the back of your mind that jazz was
Well,
the
I was
trajectory?
becoming exposed to it through television and through records that my mom would bring home.
What are some of the early jazz
Well,
performances you were
well,
seeing? Were they swing or were
Yeah,
they
swing. The very first time I heard Max Roach play, or Shelly Manne, or Roy Haynes, those became real big influences in my early years. Roy Haynes is the only one that's still alive. He's in his 90s. So it was through a record that my mom brought home that she had borrowed, because the family that she worked with, the eldest son was a hobby drummer, and he had part of a drum set at home that he would kind of fiddle on, you know, and play along the records. He found out that I was a drummer and interested in learning to play, so he even lent me that drum set at one point. He told my mom, take this album for Willie to listen to, and it had these drummers that I just mentioned.
So that was the first time that you really were consciously
Well,
learning jazz from
And
album.
it had all these different jazz drummers on there, playing all these different jazz styles, from swing to Dixieland. Lionel Hampton was in there as well, to jazz up to that point. So that kind of exposed me to something else. Hanging out with a couple of kids in the band, I found out they were, this trombonist was into jazz, and he had these records, and he lent me a couple of them. I started hearing more modern jazz, little by little, through borrowing records, and then I knew what to look for when I decided that I wanted to buy my own records and could afford to buy a record. They were like $3.50 at that time. I started taking lessons with Beto, getting ahead of myself. Maybe a year and a half further down the road, he started sending me as his sub. Okay, once I became proficient enough to play a job, and I used to go to jobs with him and sit there all night long to the last two songs he let me play with his band. We're talking about like midnight. The jobs probably didn't go any later than that, and they played all types of music, not just Latin rhythms, but also standards. I was learning all the different rhythms that he knew, so this way I would be prepared to play whatever was called in a band.
Now, when he was having you sub for him sometimes, was it
country
because
clubs.
he got another gig somewhere else where he was playing while you were subbing, or was he just like, I don't want this
Well, he
country
had his
gig?
own band, you see. They were all jazz players, but they also versatile musicians. They could play Latin, they could play society music, they could play the country clubs, anything. So what he was teaching me was enough to get me through anything that I might encounter. So the very first experience playing with professional musicians was with his band. Okay, like I said, one or two songs, depending on how I did. I might not make it to the second song if I messed up the first song, you know. So that's how it started. The first jam session that he sent me to, it was a jam session, a jazz Sunday jam session that he sent me to as his sub, was at a place called the Cloud 9 in downtown Corpus. It was basically a black club. I remember he said, go see Jimmy Pilot, who was the pianist band leader. He looked like Sammy Davis Jr. I think he only had one ear. He didn't play really modern, but he played a very bluesy swing style, like Teddy Wilson, you know, kind of more swing era. But by then, I had my own set of drums. That's a whole other story. I was like in the 9th grade. I had already decided that I wanted to make it a lifelong profession. But once I found out that I could do that, mainly because my teacher, Beto, he came from a family of drummers. He had had a day job, and he, on the side, on the weekends, he would do jobs. His brother, Rudy, who was 10 years younger than him, who was 5 years older than me, was a more modern. Beto, he grew up on Duke Ellington. Louis Bellson was one of his favorite drummers. In terms of the bebop drummers, Art Blakey was who he favored. Rudy favored Max Roach, Roy Haynes, the younger generation drummers. Rudy and I became real close as well, and he used to come by in his car and pick me up. He was a Gemini as well. He was crazier than I ever was. I learned a lot from him. I had a set of drums because my dad was against it. He didn't want the payments. And
I mean, how much was a drum kit, like what you got
like
during that day?
like $600-700 at that time, you know, which is a lot of money, you know. It was my mom and my godmother, my madrina Carmen. It was both of them jointly put their money together and afforded me to order a brand new set of drums. I did not want a used set of drums. I had already seen what my dad had in mind. You know, a conjunto set of drums from, I didn't know at the time, but I knew they were old. They're antiques. You know, they were like from the 30s. Huge bass drum and a snare drum. That was it. That's conjunto style then. I could have had those antique drums, which I wish later that I had gotten them. They were like, he was asking $35 for them, you know, as opposed to $600-700. They could have been used, but I wanted something that would fit my needs. I couldn't show up with those antique drums at a society gig at the country club. I picked something from catalogs that I liked and I thought would be suitable. You know, four-piece set of drums. That's what it was. And
Did they have a brand?
Slingerland, because that's what Gene Krupa played. That's what Roy Haynes played, you know. So I knew I was in good company if I had those drums. The first year that I had that set, my mom and my aunt, my madrina, kind of paid, you know, I think it was like maybe $45 a month that they were charging us for maybe 5 years or something, you know, which I finished paying for. Or once I started working, then I would use that money towards the drums.
I found some newspaper articles. So the Corpus Christi Caller Times said May 20th, 1962. So there was a poster that says, tonight, Maison Rouge, jazz session 7 to 11, the Joe Gallardo combo featuring Willie Cantu on drums, 1009 Santa Fe.
That's
How
amazing.
young were you when you started playing gigs? Because you're a baby here.
Well, I joined the union before that happened, probably when I was like 14.
Were you one of the youngest people to have joined the union?
Probably. My drum teacher took me down to the union secretary's home to join the union. And he was like my sponsor. The secretary of the union was the brother of Orley Cooper that I bought that set of drums from. I can't remember the name of the music store, but I remember who sold the drums to me. And I used to go into that store. It was mainly a record store, and they had booths. So I used to go there to check out the albums. I could take the records into the booth and listen and decide whether I wanted to buy. By then, I was already starting to make money.
How old were you, and what was your first professional paid gig?
Probably that jam session at the Cloud 9. I don't remember how much it paid, but it was a jam session, so I got to meet some of the local players, and they were all adults.
You're in 9th grade.
Probably around that time. I'm just seeing faces from that session. There was a black drummer that I met, that he was probably old enough to be my grandfather, but he sat in on my drums, and it's the first time I'd seen this. He took his wallet out and he set it on the snare drum, and that was to dampen. That was one of the things that a lot of drummers did at that time. They used their wallets, because if they didn't like the ringing snare drum, they would just use the wallet. At that time, they did have little dampers, a little knob on the side of the drum, because it was easier just to drop the wallet. I can't really say. I never used the wallet myself. I always wanted to hear the musical note of the drum, so the ring is part of that. Now, the other thing that I'd never seen before, he took his key change on a ring and hung it on the ride cymbal, so the keys would rattle and create a sizzle sound. I tried that, but I realized that I preferred buying a cymbal that had the rivets already pre-installed.
What was your preferred way of tuning your drum?
It was a jazz tuning, because that's what I was used to listening to. I was too young and too dumb. I mean, you have to realize at that age, I was just going a lot by natural ability, and from what I had mimicked what I'd heard people do. That's what got me through listening, which is how I got knowledge, but also what to do. Okay, well, you listen. At that jam session, I didn't know any of the tunes or songs that they played, but all I had to do was listen, and that was my guide, the music. It's like the music speaking to me, say, try this, don't do that, okay, now try this, That's how you kind of learn as you go.
Were any of your other peers also in the union playing shows, or that was just you?
No, it was just me. By the time that I left Corpus to go with Buck, nobody was playing professionally. I take it back. Not that we're in the union. There were a couple of kids that played like trumpet or saxophone, maybe guitar in a conjunto.
So when you were playing these gigs around town at that time, did the older musicians ever give you any sort of flack for being younger, or they just didn't even bat an eye?
Just encouragement. I developed to a pretty good standard to be on the same level as anyone that my teacher sent me to work to sub for him. After a year of doing that, I was already a seasoned drummer, because I had played with a lot of different people, not just this style or that style, but the majority were country club jobs. In order to do that, you had to be well versed in all the different styles of songs that were popular at that time, whether Latin, being able to play a tango or a waltz or a schottisch or whatever,
Now we're moving to the Buckaroos. At this point, you were playing the Maverick Club. you're starting in 64, and this is the year that is regarded as, quote unquote, the end of Jim, Juan Crow.
I was totally unaware of what was going on outside my world, so to speak, because all I was interested in was music. I think what opened my mind up a lot, and this is going back to when I was like in the 4th, 5th grade, due to my mom's working for people which were all Anglo, and a lot of times the people that she worked for were very good to her, and so they said, "Here, take this home. Maybe Willie will enjoy reading this." Guess what it was? National Geographic. That was what made me kind of like a world traveler. I started seeing, what's all this? Africa, Ukraine, Russia, you know, what Canada send for free maps, a picture book of Ontario, Saskatchewan. Used to order little maps and little booklets. I thought, man, it's beautiful up in Canada. I need to move up to Canada. I never knew that I would. In my mind, I could travel to anywhere outside Corpus Christi. When I discovered YouTube, I caught up with the education that I missed, because I quit high school, and I always regretted it.
So you did quit high school. What grade did you quit?
I quit when I was after 10th grade.
Did your parents, were they upset, or were they like,
no, because they knew I knew what I wanted to do. All I wanted to do was music, and that's all I could think about. And study, you know, I wanted to practice. That was my study, you know. I became so proficient that they knew what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Both band directors, I mean, I was their prized pupil, because not only was I first chair through the whole year, you know, I mean, there was nobody that would come up to my level. And I'm not, you know, I'm not bragging. I'm just saying, I mean, I worked really hard at, you know, practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Yeah.
Practice.
Doyle Holly recounted that he felt he and Don made the decision on the spot to hire you when they experienced your playing. And they said that they used to collect the phone numbers regularly of musicians on the road. I guess that was just the Buck Owens way. And was it just because, oh, if you don't work out, I've got someone else?
I never thought twice about it. I was always striving to do the best I could. Buck never complained about anything. We all did our own setups. We traveled together. We did everything together out on the road pretty well. Get to the club, you know, we set up everything ourselves. You know, someone might help us carry load in the sound system, whatever. But I carried my own drums. Nobody ever did that for me. Nobody set them up. Nobody tuned my drums. I knew what I knew what I needed to do, you know, so I took care of that. There was no reason for anything be said to any of us. Nobody was a slacker.
You might have played drums in a burlesque house band?
Yeah, that's true.
Is that true? And that was also in Corpus before?
Yeah, that was in Corpus. That was before I was even 16 or 17.
Did your parents know about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you see, I'm a professional musician. You have to realize, I'm going to play no matter where they call me. There was a shortage of drummers, proficient drummers in Corpus at that time. So my drum teacher said, here, Ford 40 was the name of this saxophone player. He was old enough to be my granddad. Anyway, he says, Ford 40 needs a drummer to play at this strip joint. The El Dorado Club was the name of it. He said, there's Ford playing saxophone, tenor saxophone, and this band director that plays piano, and there's no bass. And I thought, no bass? Oh, I'm gonna hate it. It's just a trio. And I thought, I don't know if I'm going to like that or not. He said, do you want to do it or not? And I said, yes. I never turned down a job. My motto always was, before I even realized it, I'll work with anyone once, at least. If you need a drummer, I'm your guy. You know, I'll be there. So I worked that club till the job ended. You know, it wasn't like 2 years or anything like that.
Yeah.
It was just for a month or two.
In his autobiography, Buckham, he notes that oftentimes he used session musicians, and he claims to save time and money in the recording studio. You've already joined the band, but you're flying over to Bakersfield just around the time that the band is at Capitol recording with Mel Taylor on drums. So by this time, Buck has 4 #1 singles before you even touch the ground in California. Later that year, Tiger by the Tail goes #1 in country, number 25 in pop. You're gaining all of this incredible versatility and experience doing a myriad of session gigs in Corpus. But then you get to Bakersfield, this band is on fire, and you're dropped in, and then suddenly you're just under the spotlight.
I had been in a so-called studio. I've been in the studio at the radio station, playing through the radio. I had been in maybe 2 actual recording studios that were in the back of someone's home. I had never been in a recording studio like Capitol Records before. It was all little homegrown type studios. It was just people, hobbyists, you know, wanting to record. No records were made out of anything that I recall. I had no clue what I was headed for, because I had heard Buck Owens on the jukebox, and I liked Ray Price, Buck Owens, Jim Reeves. That's what I liked at the club, that I heard, that I liked. And when they performed at the club that night, which is the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated, I stayed the whole night, because we were supposed to alternate with Buck's band, but he decided, since the place, no more than 50 people there, which is horrendous, he decided just to do the whole thing himself, the band, you know, he and his band. So it was good because it gave me an idea of what they were like for a whole night. You know, I stayed there amazed at the sound, totally unlike anything I'd ever heard before. And the drummer only had a bass drum, a snare drum, and a hi-hat. No toms, no ride or crash cymbals.
And we're talking Mel King?
Mel King, yeah. That's all he played, was hi-hat and cross stick, all night long. And I thought, how can that be that all he's playing is song after song, that same sound, those 2 sounds, and it doesn't sound boring. I couldn't figure that out until I experienced it myself, because I wasn't playing like that with the country band that I was playing. You know.
What was the difference between how you were playing?
The band that I was with was an older style and more like a Bob Wills style.
Western swing, yeah.
Yeah, and so the drummer plays the actual snare drum rather than crossing the stick. In jazz, we would cross the stick during the subdued parts of a tune. Say, play the ride cymbal in a cross stick. If a piano, which is a softer instrument, you know, it was a softer sound, so therefore you had to do things like that back then. But to play that cross stick and hi-hat all night long, it was something else. It didn't strike me as, okay, when is he going to do something else? Because it all sounded right.
What about the sound, the other elements?
Okay, the sound was very different. The sound was very bright, especially starting with the bass. You could actually tell what the bass player was doing because it had a lot of treble in it as well as bass. Most electric bass players sounded like back then. It was real boomy. You couldn't really tell what, you know, the sound was just all over the place, no real definition. Doyle's bass sound was because of Buck. Okay? He wanted all the instruments to be brighter on stage, and that's why no one else sounded like Buck's band at that particular time, because everyone else went for a more a mellower sound, mellow guitar sound, which is like a jazz guitar sound. Say for example, Ernest Tubbs' band. Buck played a Telecaster and had that treble cranked up to where it was just a different sound altogether.
And it's because it registered better on AM?
Well, became, I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I've heard him say that myself, or people have said that he said that. I don't remember that, but I know that overall he wanted a brighter sound on stage. The real clear treble sound is purely Buck Owens, because that's the sound that he used for himself. That's what made him sound like Buck Owens. That gave him a distinct identity. He was a session player for Capitol Records, and so you'd have jazz players playing, well-known jazz players playing rhythm guitar, same sessions, because they were studio guys, you know. I'm sure Buck, you know, just stood out because of the sound. You know, that's the sound that he preferred to have. And so it carried through to the steel guitar, to Don. Don became like a Buck clone, so to speak, because he was a teenager when he joined Buck too, like I was. So Don was an outgrowth of Buck and everything else that he became influenced by. Early rock and roll. Yeah, he was influenced by Chuck Berry, and when I came into the band, I brought more jazz influence into it. So he listened to a lot of people that I would give him records of, you know.
So he was open to that music.
Yeah, he was. So that's why Don and I kind of were like somewhat the closest. He was closer to me in age, 5 years older than me. He had a more musically open mind. He was willing to try different things. Not that Buck wasn't, but they were different generations.
Yeah, absolutely. You know? And he admits that as much as well, I think, when he's giving credit to not only the other band members, but also Don. When you're in the studio at Capitol, there's a photo. The order in the photo is Don, you, Tom, and Buck. And it looks to be in a Capitol Records recording session. But you're holding a guitar. So are you...
I thought you were going to say that.
Are you multi-instrumental? Are you proficient on guitar?
Being in that band, I became less inhibited and quiet and shy, this quiet, shy guy. I just kind of blossomed out, you might sort of say. And so I'd horse around a lot, and that's all that was. I picked up Don's guitar just for the photo.
What were you guys actually recording at that moment? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Yeah, because he did often use session musicians on the actual recorded singles and non-live albums. How often were you actually playing drums on what became the recorded studio material? What singles?
I was the only drummer. The only person of the Buckaroos that didn't record on all the albums was Doyle. Whoever became the bass player when Wayne Wilson came into the band for that 1 year, he played on the session. He played rhythm. He never played bass. I think the previous year, all the sessions were done by the same bass player, Bob Morris. He's the one that wrote Buckaroo, the instrumental. So he was always the bass player, on an electric bass player. There was one time that Buck tried acoustic bass, and that was for Waiting in Your Welfare Line, and that was Bert Dodson or some. I never knew the man before. I somehow remember his name, but he recorded maybe on that whole session. He played acoustic. I do not remember that, but I know for sure that on that particular song.
Did that ever hurt Doyle, the fact that all the other members were playing their instruments?
Well, if it did or didn't, does not, it's we'll never know. But Bob Morris, the bass player, he'd been there before Doyle, a long time before Doyle, as a session player. So he joined the Buckaroos knowing well what the score was, so to speak.
So there's a story that pedal steel player Tom Brumley was to play immediately when he was flying in with this gig. He was hired to replace Jay McDonald, and then he gets there and the pedal steel was sabotaged.
The previous steel guitar player left his guitar behind, which is a Fender 1000. All the guitars were Fender. Jay, for some reason, I can't remember if he quit I don't think he got fired. I could be wrong, but I don't remember that. When Tom inherited that steel guitar and didn't see the guitar until he got to the job, he opened the guitar, the case up, and all the strings on the steel guitar had been cut. He couldn't play a guitar like that, of course. So I don't remember what happened in terms of how quickly they were able to find strings for Tom to re-string the guitar.
Did anything like that happen to you when you came onto the band?
Well, no, nothing with my equipment. They drove off.
And he mentions in the autobiography that you were left behind more often than the other
Well,
bands.
because
Why?
I would always, being quiet and shy and everything, I didn't always want to socialize with the guys because whatever they used to talk about had nothing to do with like right now, and it was all guide talk. Mm-hmm. And it was boring to me. And so I would just go to the back of the van or the bus and take a nap. If we're traveling and made a pit stop, a lot of times they might say that we're stopping. If you need to do anything, get out now. I was inexperienced. I just, by the time I got up and got out, they were already probably on their way back, and that's how it happened.
Were you ever in a dangerous situation being left behind?
No. I vividly remember this. We were up in Canada, I think, where it happened, and I'm thinking, surely they're not just going to drive away and leave me here. And maybe a half hour later, here they were, back for me. It took them that long to find out that I wasn't in the back. So a rule was made right then and there that always let somebody know, whoever it is, if anybody is staying behind or getting off, you always let somebody know that you're gone.
Yeah, the buddy system.
Flying to Bakersfield, I didn't know where Buck's standing was in the country music world. I knew he had a couple record hits, Act Naturally and Love's Gonna Live Here, I'd heard on the jukebox. That session produced 2 #1 songs. They were back to back and forth. Together Again and My Heart Skips a Beat. I believe that was the way it happened.
Yeah, they were the flip sides.
Yeah.
So you leave what you know in Corpus, you're in Bakersfield, you immediately begin the whirlwind of touring and TV shows and I'm assuming also radio spots, but he didn't talk very much about those in the book.
The biggest change for me was living with Anglos.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Because there was another world for me. I was the only non-white, so to speak, I could not get used to the way they ate white biscuits with white gravy. That was the weirdest thing to me. And the first time I got offered that was at Buck's home, when he came back from LA after that session and sat down for breakfast the next day, and I see all this white stuff on the table, biscuits and gravy. Give me a tortilla. And no tortillas anywhere, I couldn't even import them myself at that point,
Yeah. So there was no corner store
make
you
them
could
myself,
go to get tortillas.
I'd have to drive all the way into Bakersfield to a store that maybe sold everything. Of course, naturally, I've always adapted to whatever it was, but it was really difficult because we're out on the road. We stopped at the very first truck stop, and I wasn't used to eating in restaurants. Never ate in a restaurant, other than pecan pie, back home. But what is this? I'm looking at what I didn't know what I was going to eat. There was no Mexican food section on there.
Yeah. I mean, were they perceptive to this? Like, did they notice that you were kind of having this moment?
I don't know. I'm sure I would think that they.
But nobody gave you like a 101 adaptation guide.
Don might have. I would think of anyone. Don, and we pretty well sat together. We sat together in twos. If Buck was with us, try to find booths big enough for 3 and 2, you know. I think Don would kind of say, well, try this or try that. The very first time I ever heard of a Caesar salad or a shrimp Louis was that was
what a shrimp Louis
well,
is.
it was just a salad with shrimp.
Okay.
I grew up eating at home. The only time I ate anywhere, well, there was the Black Cow, which was like an A&W type place.
Or is this in Corpus?
This is in Corpus. Or Whataburger, you know. We'd stop at Whataburger when we'd go to the drive-in on some Fridays or Saturday nights after my dad got off work. It was all home. Either my mom or my dad cooked. I think I've probably tried my hand at making tortillas, you know, roll the white masa, you know, and I've done the other tortillas by hand, which are my favorite. My dad, I used to see him make tortillas,
Oh, really?
you know, with a rolling pin.
Yeah.
The only time I cooked for my parents when I was at home was I decided to fix them breakfast one Sunday. This one we lived at La Armada, and I made like 1,000 pancakes. That's I'm exaggerating, but I made stacks of okay, here's breakfast, you know. So traveling and eating food at truck stops, or we'd stay at Holiday Inns most of the time. We'd go to the Holiday Inn restaurant, and that was a totally, what am I doing here? There's all these white people. I don't see anybody black or half black, but you know, I had to get used to that.
Yeah.
And
Now, to be honest, though, when you're touring the South with them around this time, and you're noting like you're the only non-white person there, are you also getting any sort of vibes from them as to like who is this?
I don't remember anything ever happening.
Yeah.
It was a long time before we actually played the South, the Deep South. I think it was different there. It was more mixed. On the road, if we stayed at Holiday Inn, that's where we ate. That's the first time I ever had steak. You know, it was mainly because of Don. Actually, he loved prime rib, you know, and I hated it because it wasn't really cooked well. A lot of things that I learned to like were things that he suggested, because he had experienced them before, so therefore he was like my go-between, you know.
Did they ever ask you anything about your family's culture, your background? Did you guys ever have deep talks with each other about?
Buck mainly, because he grew up around a lot of Mexican people. It influenced some of his music.
And he had mentioned that, and I always wondered if because of his family's exposure, like working in the fields and working alongside people of other colors, if that also just automatically made him open to, or not even conscious of even hiring.
He understood the cultures enough to be comfortable around it because of his growing up, and he understood what I might be going through. I can't give you an example, but he would drop things from time to time, you know, about not everyone's like that, you know, and just things to kind of make me more comfortable. And
that's really good to know. I wondered about that.
Well, he was in his 30s, you know, he was a mature man. He was a very smart person through his own tenacity, self-educated. You know, he loved to read. He never did any drugs. I doubt that he ever did. People think that maybe he did. Not when I was with him.
So even if you all had to drive those insane road stretches, I know you were trading off, but I mean, even back in the day, it seemed like so many musicians were doing speed
drugs.
Just to...
We didn't call them drugs. They were Benzedrine.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the popular form.
That was really big in jazz circles too, and the beatnik circles.
There was a thing called the Benny bag, and I finally asked Don, "What's a Benny bag?" And it was this shaving kit. They were small then, smaller than as we know now, and they carried their pills in there. I don't know where they got them. I never bought them myself.
You can tell the truth. Just kidding.
No, I never bought them myself. But I did take a few, like mainly if we had a long haul, driving wise. Don and I was usually, we co-piloted for each other. I remember him saying, this is a Benny pill. He says, if you're getting tired, this will keep you awake and alert. And so that's probably how I took one, but I wasn't a regular consumer because I did not smoke, I did not drink, I didn't feel the need for anything, any kind of stimulant. He said, well, brandy is kind of harmless. So he bought me a small pint of peach brandy. We were in the Bay Area, actually. We didn't have the motorhome then, or the bus, which came later. We had the camper, pickup truck with a camper, big camper on the back. I broke off with her over the phone, and I just felt absolutely rotten. And Don said, I'll get you a bottle of brandy. I didn't drink. I'm getting too flighty from all this talk.
Yeah.
You know, because I'm reliving it.
Absolutely.
So therefore, it's kind of
it's taking a lot of you.
Well, it's taken me to a different zone psychologically, and I'm starting to feel a little. Okay, am I talking too much? There is, and it's been coming for a long time that I was going to do something on my own like this. I've done other interviews, 2 or 3 others. It's basically covering the same sort of stuff. This is a little different than that.
Which is what I wanted.
And so I wasn't sure that I would remember a lot about growing up before I got interested in playing music, and you're kind of making me come out with a lot of that stuff that
and that's what I want because I feel like
mind.
So much of the technical territory has been covered. Or have you produced any sessions for anyone or for yourself?
No.
No, and you just didn't have interest in that?
No interest, and here in Nashville, it's not something that I've pursued. Right now, I very rarely will accept a session. If it's more than like 2 sessions, I won't do them. That's like 6 hours. That's way too long for me to sit and focus on just doing same song over and over. It's not the way I want to live and play. It's not the way I want to make music. So therefore, I do what I enjoy the most, which is play clubs.
It's been noted that Buck paid clothing designer Nathan Turk to make the band's show outfits, and it was suggested that he would use Turk because he was doing really quality work, but he was more affordable than Nudie. And I don't think a lot of people really know how much cowboy culture and country culture borrowed from like Spanish, Tex-Mex, Norteño culture, taking elements of the charro suits and even indigenous dress with like the fringe, that these were like incorporated into what Nudie and Turk would design. And somewhere it was mentioned that initially when you joined the band and you had maybe your first suit that was being made for you, that you weren't super keen on wearing the suit. Is that true? And like, how did you feel about the visual style of the band that was required?
I saw them wearing a similar style suit, what they call a bolero jacket. They were not rhinestone suits, but they were that style of suit with the flared bottom, bell bottom type, and they wore boots. When I joined the band, I wore what Mel had worn.
But you actually adopted his suit?
Yes, because that's all there was. And mind you, the pants were a little high water, and I complained about that. His jacket was probably too big because I was skinny as a rail then. But within that first year, we got our first change. Gold colored jackets and black pants with maybe gold going on the side, And I'm trying to remember if the jackets were that flashy gold. And then he got regular cloth suits with rhinestones that mirrored his, an opposite color of his. We're talking about stage presence, flashy. His thing is people want to be entertained. That's why he clowned around the way he did.
Even just watching the episodes of Buck Owens' ranch show, you're the best looking band in the business. Like,
Well,
you guys looked amazing.
Nobody else wore the suits that we did. They wore the nudie suits with the long jacket. That was the old style, the long jackets, And previously, when Buck traveled as a single, before his suits were like that, long jacket. I don't know where he got the idea. I never asked him. I never heard as to how he came up with the idea of those short jackets. But that's the Spanish style. The bullfighter, or whatever else you want to call it.
Yeah. It's a mixture, like the vaquero culture and the mariachis are pulling a little bit of both. Like they're adapting the Spanish bolero.
That's what I wore when I first joined the band. Don and Buck wore boots. Doyle might have worn boots.
And you're saying like cowboy boots,
Cowboy
right?
boots, with the riding heel, not walking heel. And Tom wore just regular loafers.
Wore loafers?
Shiny.
Never noticed.
That type of a shoe, shiny but slip-on. Okay. Well, what I was wearing, I wore what they call beetle boots, which is really a Spanish style boot. That was high top. The ones that I wore had a slight high heel. It was a while before I actually owned a pair of boots. I bought a pair of boots. They were alligator skin that I bought from. They were Bucks. They were a Cordovan, and we wore the same size boot. And that became what I wore until Tony Lama decided to sponsor us.
Oh, fantastic.
And
I
give
have
us all
Tony
matching
Lama.
boots. And so then we had more boots than we needed,
So you didn't have a problem with
No, I never had a problem. But because by then I got used to wearing and by the time we got the new suits, I was ready to get out of those old ones,
Yeah. When you all were being shot for the album covers, I did notice it didn't seem like there was ever a specific order that any of the members were in. Like, did Buck or Don or anyone in the band have any say over how any one person was presented over another in the band?
Well, let's go back to the title, Buckaroo. That came about, we were at the session, Bob Morris presented it. We recorded it, and it didn't take maybe a couple of takes. And the beat that I played was a Latin type beat, okay? And
it's my favorite
that
song.
is a combination of a maraca pattern. It's not an actual cymbal bell pattern. I don't recall what influenced me. Just the song itself. What I played on the record was what I heard then and there. Also, we were asked, well, what shall we call this? The name that Bob Morris had for it was something else, totally unrelated to the Buckaroos, and I don't remember what it was. So they said, okay, we want you guys to get out of the sound room and come up with a name. So I came up with because of the Spanish influence, El Buckaroo. And I don't remember what any other names that anyone had, but I think they took what I suggested and just cut out the L to make it more country. The L, that makes it Hispanic, rather than if it's just Buckaroo, then it's probably more doable, more sellable in the country and western field. It didn't matter to me what they called it. That was just what I came up with.
Yeah, so when you're doing these sessions, you're recording these singles, you're recording the albums, they have the songwriter and songwriters plural that are given the publishing. But a lot of times, because each individual band member brings like their own
songs,
their own element to that song, do you ever feel like you had a moment on any of the songs that you played on where you should have, or you wanted, or you deserved publishing on any of the songs? Did any of the band members, or did you ever feel?
Well, the majority of the time, 99 and 2/3%, so to speak, the songs were either written by Buck or co-written by Buck. Okay, he would not record anything unless he got half publishing.
Which is part of what made him such a brilliant businessman.
Yeah, exactly. With a song like Buckaroo, a tune like Buckaroo, Bob Morris, being who he was and what he meant to us in the studio, that he probably might have gotten royalties. For example, when we went to Japan, on the way there, on the flight, Buck calls me over and he says, "Listen, I want you to play something." He might have had his guitar, with no amp, of course, and he said, "This is what I want to do. Come up with something for this." He says, "We're going to call this the Tokyo Polka." Well, on the album, Live in Japan, we do that, and I had to do a drum solo just by myself, which is very brief. It was a conscious effort on my part. I was nervous, and I didn't want to hog the show. So therefore, it was pretty, maybe a minute and a half long. Well, I got credit as having written Buck announces that I wrote this drum solo for them. I just made it on the spot. The Tokyo Polka is pretty unique because I've never heard the beat that I played.
And describe the beat that you played.
It's kind of sort of a train beat, and you've heard that beat on, say, like maybe Rocky Top. But the way I played it and the way it sounded with what Buck was doing, it wasn't a typical polka pattern. A polka beat would be boom, pat, boom, pat, boom, pat, boom, pat. It wasn't, I accentuated the 2 and 4, but I was doing a lot more than that, okay? And so, co-written by Willie Cantu, I don't know, because when I left the band a year later, I gave up all my rights to any royalties. It didn't matter.
Was that something that when you came into the band, you knew that if you left the band, you would have to give those up?
No, there wasn't any need for me to know that, because I just joined the band. I wasn't thinking of exiting, anytime soon. But the thought had crossed my mind before, when I accepted the job, that what if I don't like it? What if I can't stand it? All these questions happened. And I thought, well, Los Angeles is just not too far away. I can move there and play jazz. That was kind of in the back of my mind if it didn't work out with Buck. When I got there, Buck's wife, while they were out of town, said, "Buck wants you to listen to these albums that he's made. In case you're not familiar with a lot of the songs, this will do it." So I spent the time while I was there listening to the albums, and pretty well I knew what my job was. So there was no need for actual rehearsal, but I at least wanted to know what songs we were doing. So it never happened. When they were home to get away from playing and the music. First club we were playing up in California, Redding. Don and I were rooming together, and I'm complaining about the high water pans and all this to him. Buck walks in just to check and see how we're all doing, how his new drummer is. I wanted to see what I looked like wearing that Mel's outfit. And so I said to him, "Is there anything I need to know?" I said, "We haven't rehearsed or anything." And he said, "Well, there was no need to rehearse." And he said, "Well, what you need to know is we play on top of the beat." That's what was different about his music than the Nashville way of playing, okay, which is right on the beat. And I didn't know what he was talking about. Later found out, I knew without really knowing that that's what it was once we actually played. And he said, "If I don't like what you're doing, I will always let you know." So none of that happened, ever. We start playing, and it was almost like I'd always been there, because I was feeling rhythm the same way they were. I understood what he meant by playing on top of the beat without actually, I never intellectualized it, you know. Okay, this is that. Or I knew if you were dragging, that I was aware of because I played with people that drag. But I think what prepared me for Buck was the fact, being a jazz player, the sense of who I listened to. Cannonball Adderley. He was real popular around 1960. That's when he first started his band. And his drummer that he had, who was also a younger drummer, Louis Hayes. He stole Louis from Horace Silver's band. And it was great because Louis played with that on top field. I was a big fan of that band. I just understood where to put the time through the way that music made me feel. And I think Buck's music had that same kind of feeling. So it was easy for me to transition.
And I think also to their credit too, especially the way that they did collect numbers, they were looking for that chemistry, and so they spied that in you. Obviously there was no question that you could just fit in, like they didn't have to sit you down and educate you.
What Don told me at one time was that he was impressed that I could play a tune called Orange Blossom Special, which is a fiddle tune.
Yeah, it was big on the Bakersfield.
And the guy that was in our band was a pretty good fiddle player. However fast and it was usually breakneck tempo, speed. Once you hear the tempo change, you have to immediately lock into that. Don was impressed that I could play as fast as the fiddle player, and it was a tune that he played himself with Buck. And that was one of the key factors that apparently a lot of other drummers were just not able to play. Even Mel couldn't play. Mel might have recorded it with Don on one of the albums, but I've heard it, and he plays halftime. You really don't notice it because you have the rhythm guitar playing 2 and 4. And you can't hear that Mel is playing hi-hat halftime to be able to play, to be able to stay in time. I'm sure. That was all I knew was he had told Buck that hey, this kid can play any tempo you throw at him.
And I think it was also so different during that era of musicianship where, first of all, you're already coming into the band and you're so practiced, you're so versatile. So many other musicians, in order to rise to the top, like that talent just had to be there. And you get to that certain level of playing, you don't even need to, like, rehearsing isn't required for people that are at your caliber.
Well, what it is learning to listen and use your ear to guide you, even you're in uncharted territory.